Have you ever had one of those moments where you're so certain you're in the right, so completely confident in your position, that the absurdity of someone else's attack leaves you momentarily speechless? That was me on a perfect autumn evening, staring at the flashing red and blue lights painting my new fence in strobing waves of panic. All because a woman who weaponized beige paint swatches and lawn height regulations had decided my perfectly legal, perfectly safe bonfire was a five-alarm threat to civilization. She had called the fire department on me. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have factored into her petty calculations of neighborhood dominance, was that the man who stepped out of the command vehicle, the fire chief himself, was my Uncle Frank. My name is Alex, and I'm a cartographer and geographic information systems analyst. My job is to take complex data, property lines, zoning laws, utility easements, geological surveys, and turn it into clear, undeniable maps. I make sense of the world by plotting it on a grid. I thrive on order, data, and irrefutable facts. After years of living in a cramped city apartment, all I wanted was a small patch of earth to call my own, a place with a yard where I could see the stars and enjoy the simple pleasure of a crackling fire. I found that place in a quiet, unassuming subdivision called Willow Creek Estates, a name far grander than the reality of its modest but well-kept single-family homes. The HOA, according to the documents I meticulously reviewed before closing, seemed reasonable enough. The rules were standard. Keep your lawn tidy, don't paint your house purple, the usual stuff. It seemed a small price to pay for community pools and maintained common areas. I spent a month settling in, meticulously ensuring every aspect of my property was in perfect compliance. I even measured the distance of my garden gnomes from the sidewalk, just in case. The final piece of my suburban dream was a beautiful, heavy-gauge steel fire pit. It wasn't some rusty barrel. It was a work of art, complete with a fine mesh spark screen and a heavy lid. I checked every city and county ordinance. The fire pit had to be at least 25 feet from any structure, which mine was. The fire had to be contained, which it was. Open burning was prohibited, but recreational fires in approved containers were explicitly permitted. I had my bases covered. I was a man of data and regulations. I followed the rules. That first fire was magical. The sun had set, the air was crisp, and the scent of burning oak filled my backyard. I had a beer in one hand and a book in the other. This was it. Peace. That peace lasted for exactly 17 minutes. That's when my new neighbor, Brenda, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, marched up to my fence line. She was a woman who seemed perpetually wound tight, with a haircut you could set your watch to, and an expression that suggested she just smelled something unpleasant. "You can't do that," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet evening. I looked up from my book, confused. "I'm sorry," I asked politely. "That fire," she said, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger. "It's a violation, and a nuisance. The smoke is getting into my prize-winning petunias." I glanced over at her yard. Her petunias were a good 50 feet away, and the gentle breeze was blowing the smoke in the opposite direction. "Hi, I'm Alex," I said, extending a hand that she completely ignored. I checked all the city ordinances and the HOA bylaws. "This is a permitted recreational fire." Her face tightened, the skin around her eyes crinkling with indignation. "I'm the president of the HOA board, young man. I know the bylaws better than you do. You are creating a dangerous situation and a terrible smell. Put it out now, or I will be forced to take action. I'm not a confrontational person. I prefer logic to shouting." "Brenda," I said, remembering her name from the welcome packet, "I assure you, I've done my due diligence. The fire is contained, it's a safe distance from everything, and it's perfectly legal. I'd be happy to show you the city ordinance website if you'd like." This was the wrong thing to say. Offering facts to a person powered by pure ego is like throwing water on a grease fire. "Are you calling me a liar?" she hissed. "I will not be disrespected. I am calling the fire department." And with that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house. Phone already pressed her ear. I sat there, stunned. This was beyond an overreaction. It was a declaration of war. I sighed, took a sip of my beer, and watched the flames dance, assuming that a 911 dispatcher would tell her not to waste their time. 10 minutes later, the siren started. A full-size fire engine, lights blazing, rolled down my quiet suburban street and parked in front of my house. This is the story of how a petty tyrant with a clipboard tried to ruin my life over a small, legal fire, and how she inadvertently handed me the very tools I needed to dismantle her entire empire of misery, one data point at a time. Have you ever been so underestimated that it became your greatest weapon? The arrival of the fire engine was a spectacle. Neighbors poked their heads out of their doors, curtains twitched, and I could feel the collective gaze of Willow Creek Estates focusing on my little backyard. Brenda stood on her porch, arms crossed, with a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. She had brought the thunder. She had summoned the cavalry of municipal authority to smite the non-compliant peasant next door. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment and anger. My quiet evening was now a public incident. The firefighters, to their credit, were professional but visibly unimpressed. A burly man with a magnificent mustache hopped down from the truck and walked towards me. "Evening, sir. We got a call about an out-of-control, illegal burn," he said, his tone already skeptical as he took in my modest, well-contained fire pit. Before I could answer, Brenda strode across her lawn like a conquering general. "That's right, officer. This man is endangering the entire neighborhood. There are embers flying everywhere." The firefighter glanced at the heavy mesh spark screen on my pit, through which no ember larger than a gnat could possibly escape. He looked at the calm, gently burning logs. He looked back at Brenda. "Ma'am, this appears to be a standard recreational fire." Just then, a black SUV with official municipal plates pulled up behind the engine. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a crisp, white uniform shirt with gold collar pins. "Fire Chief Frank Morrison. My Uncle Frank." His eyes scanned the scene. The engine, the firefighters, Brenda's indignant posture, and me standing awkwardly by my fire pit. A small, weary smile touched his lips. He knew this type of call all too well. "What's all this, then?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority that immediately silenced everyone. Brenda, seeing the uniform and sensing a higher power to appeal to, puffed up her chest. "Chief, thank goodness you're here. I reported this illegal and dangerous fire. This young man refuses to comply with safety regulations." Uncle Frank walked over to my fire pit, his boots crunching softly on the grass. He circled it once, peered inside, and then looked at me. "Alex," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching. "Didn't know you'd moved into my jurisdiction." "Hi, Uncle Frank," I mumbled, feeling like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar, even though I'd done nothing wrong. The blood drained from Brenda's face. Her triumphant smirk dissolved into a slack-jawed mask of confusion. "Uncle," she stammered. Frank ignored her for a moment. He turned to the firefighter. "What's the assessment, Lieutenant?" "Perfectly compliant, Chief," the man replied. "Approved container, 25 feet from structures, spark screen in place." "He's following the code to the letter," Frank nodded, then turned his full attention to Brenda. His demeanor shifted from familial to official. "Ma'am, my nephew, like any other citizen, is permitted to have a recreational fire as long as he abides by city and county fire codes, which he is clearly doing. This call, however, has tied up a pumper truck and a 4-man crew that might be needed for a real emergency." "Wasting emergency services is a serious issue," Brenda sputtered, her face turning a shade of crimson that clashed horribly with her beige cardigan. But the HOA, the bylaws, the smoke. The HOA bylaws do not supersede municipal fire codes," Uncle Frank stated flatly. "And unless the smoke is creating a genuine hazard, which it is not, it's a private matter. My men are leaving. I suggest you go back inside and allow my nephew to enjoy his evening." He gave her a look that could freeze lava. Defeated and utterly humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, Brenda scurried back to her house without another word. Uncle Frank clapped me on the shoulder. "Welcome to the neighborhood, kid. Looks like you've already met the welcome wagon." He winked, then got back in his SUV and drove off, the fire engine following behind him. The immediate crisis was over, but I knew the war had just begun. I had won the battle, but Brenda was the type of person who would never, ever let go of a grudge. The public humiliation she suffered would fuel a campaign of relentless, petty vengeance. The next morning, it started. A crisp, white envelope was taped to my front door. It was an official HOA violation notice. Fine, $50. Reason, unapproved lawn ornamentation, garden gnome. I looked at the gnome in question. It was a classic, red-hatted fellow my grandmother had given me. It was tasteful. It was also, according to a subsection of the bylaws Brenda had helpfully highlighted, a violation if not placed within a designated flower bed. Mine was 2 inches onto the lawn. The following day, another notice. Fine, $75. Reason, improper mailbox maintenance, non-standard hue of black. Apparently, my mailbox, which was the exact same as every other mailbox on the street, had faded slightly in the sun and was now soot black instead of the approved midnight black the week after a $100 fine for my grass being, and I quote, a quarter of an inch in excess of the maximum allowable height of 3 inches. In one specific patch near the driveway. It became a daily ritual of dread, walking to my front door to see what new, ludicrous infraction she had invented. I was living under a microscope, and Brenda was the one holding the lens. I tried to resolve it reasonably. I called her. The call went straight to a full voicemail box. I emailed her, providing photographic evidence that my mailbox was the same color as the HOA vice president's. The email bounced back. She had blocked my address. I attended the next monthly HOA meeting, hoping to plead my case in a public forum. When I stood up to speak, Brenda, sitting at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, cut me off. This is not the appropriate venue for individual violation disputes, she declared. Please submit your appeal in writing to the Architectural Review Committee. I later discovered that the Architectural Review Committee was comprised of 3 people, Brenda and 2 of her closest friends. My written appeal was unsurprisingly denied. The fines were now totaling over $500, with late fees being added. She was burying me in paper, bleeding me dry with petty charges, all because I had embarrassed her. I felt helpless and trapped. This was her kingdom, and she was an absolute monarch. But as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of violation notices, the frustration began to cool and harden into something else. Resolve. She thought she was fighting some random guy who would eventually give up and pay. She didn't know who I was. She didn't know that my entire career was built on finding patterns in chaos, on imposing order on messy data, and on revealing the truth hidden in plain sight. She had started a war of attrition based on rules. That was a war I was uniquely equipped to win. She wanted to play by the book? Fine. I would read the book, digitize it, analyze it, and then I would beat her with it. My quiet life was over, but a new project was just beginning. My first step was to build a fortress of compliance around myself. If Brenda wanted to use the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the CC and RS, as a weapon, I needed to be completely bulletproof. I took the 300-page binder of bylaws I'd received at closing and scanned every single page into a searchable PDF. I spent an entire weekend reading it cover to cover, highlighting every rule, every restriction, every procedural nuance. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity, filled with vaguely worded clauses that gave the board enormous discretionary power. It was designed to be wielded, not followed. I created a checklist. Lawn height. I bought a new lawnmower with precise height settings and cut my grass twice a week. Mailbox color. I went to the approved hardware store and bought a can of midnight black paint, meticulously repainting my mailbox and taking time-stamped photos of the process. Garden gnome. I built a small, raised flower bed exactly to the specifications outlined in the bylaws and placed the gnome squarely in the center, documenting the construction with a tape measure in every shot. I went through every single one of Brenda's bogus violations and created a dossier of my compliance, complete with photographic evidence, receipts, and sworn affidavits for myself. It was overkill, but I knew I was dealing with someone who would argue the color of the sky. I submitted this mountain of evidence to the board via certified mail, ensuring I had a record of its delivery. The response was a curt letter a week later stating that the fines would stand, As they were issued prior to my remedial actions, they were essentially fining me for the past, with no possibility of appeal. This confirmed my suspicion. This wasn't about compliance. It was about punishment. The fines are just the stick she was using to beat me. That's when the project expanded. My personal defense was complete, but it wasn't enough. I needed to go on the offensive. My home office, usually dedicated to municipal zoning projects, transformed into a war room. My dual monitors, which normally displayed sewer lines and electrical grids, were now filled with the digital guts of Willow Creek Estates. My weapon of choice was my professional-grade GIS software, a powerful program that could layer maps and data in infinite combinations. My first task was to create a perfect base map of the entire subdivision. I obtained the official plat maps from the county recorder's office, high-resolution aerial imagery from the state's geospatial data clearinghouse, and property boundary data from the tax assessor. I spent hours digitizing every single property line, every street, every sidewalk, and every common area until I had a perfect, to-scale digital replica of our neighborhood. This was my battlefield. Next, I began to add the data layers. I took the CC and RS I had scanned and started the painstaking process of translating the legalistic text into spatial data. For example, the rule about fences stated they could be no more than 6 feet high and had to be of a specific material and color. I created a layer for fences with attributes for height, material, and color. The rule about sheds dictated their maximum square footage and distance from property lines. I created a layer for sheds. I did this for everything: mailboxes, landscaping, paint colors, satellite dishes, basketball hoops, even the specific types of trees that were allowed to be planted. It was a monstrous task, consuming my nights and weekends. I felt like a detective, an archaeologist, and a data scientist all rolled into one. I systematically went through the neighborhood, block by block, during my evening walks. I used a laser distance measurer to check setbacks. I used a color matching app on my phone to sample paint colors. I took thousands of discrete photos, documenting every single house in the subdivision. People probably thought I was just some weirdo admiring their gardens, but I was, in fact, gathering intelligence. I was building the most comprehensive database of HOA compliance and non-compliance that had ever existed. As I populated my map with this data, patterns began to emerge. Tiny, insignificant violations were everywhere. Mrs. Gable at number 12 had a non-approved mailbox flag. Mr. Henderson at number 27 had a small crack in his driveway that was technically a violation. The entire subdivision was a minefield of minor infractions. Yet when I cross-referenced this with the list of fines I'd requested from the HOA, which, as a homeowner, I was entitled to, a stark picture appeared. The fines weren't being applied universally. They were concentrated on a handful of properties. I created a heat map, and it was damning. My property was a glowing red, as were the homes of a few other residents, while vast swaths of the neighborhood, despite having similar or worse violations, were completely clean. This was proof of selective and arbitrary enforcement. It was a powerful piece of evidence, but it wasn't the kill shot. It was still my word against Brenda's. I needed something more. I needed something undeniable. The aha moment came late one Tuesday night. I was combing through the original development plans from the county clerk's office, comparing them to the current aerial photos and my own ground-level observations. I was focused on the common areas, the green belts, the park, the land around the community pool. According to the official plat map, a 10-foot wide public utility easement, PUE, ran along the back of every property line, a designated space for things like power lines, water mains, and sewer pipes. Building any permanent structure on a PUE is a huge no-no. It can prevent utility companies from accessing their equipment for maintenance or emergencies. It was a fundamental rule, not just of the HOA, but of the city itself. I traced the easement line on my digital map, following it behind each house. And then I saw it. I zoomed in, my heart starting to pound. I cross-referenced it with the aerial photo. I pulled up my own ground-level pictures. There was no doubt. At the back of one particular property, a large, beautifully constructed wooden deck with a built-in stone barbecue extended a full 15 feet from the back of the house. 5 of those feet, including 2 of the main concrete support pillars for the deck, were sitting squarely inside the public utility easement. It was a clear, significant, and potentially dangerous violation. A violation that had existed for years, completely ignored by the board. The property, of course, belonged to Brenda. Discovering Brenda's illegal deck was like finding a key to a lock I didn't even know existed. It changed everything. This wasn't a minor infraction like a mismatched mailbox color or an overgrown patch of grass. This was a serious, structural violation of both HOA rules and fundamental city planning codes. It wasn't just a breach of neighborhood aesthetics. It was a potential safety hazard and a legal liability for the entire community. If a water main under that deck were to burst, the utility company would have the right to tear the entire structure down to get to their pipes, and the HOA could potentially be on the hook for allowing it to be built in the first place. This was the bombshell I needed. But having the information was one thing. Deploying it effectively was another. I couldn't just enter an anonymous note or post a picture on the community Facebook page. That would be petty, and it would give her the chance to spin the story, play the victim, or bury it in committee meetings. No, this had to be a public execution. It had to be undeniable, irrefutable, and delivered in a forum where she had no control. The annual HOA meeting was in 6 weeks. It was the perfect venue. It was the one meeting all year that a large number of homeowners actually attended, as it was when the budget was approved and board members were elected. Brenda would be at the height of her power, presiding over the proceedings, feeling completely untouchable. My strategy began to crystallize. I wouldn't just expose her deck. I would build a comprehensive, data-driven case that would not only prove her hypocrisy, but would also demonstrate her pattern of targeted harassment and dereliction of duty as president. My presentation would have 3 acts. Act 1, my own persecution. I would detail every fine levied against me and present my mountain of evidence proving my complete compliance. This would establish my credibility and show the audience that I was a reasonable person who had been systematically targeted. Act 2, the pattern of abuse. I would unveil the heat map. I would show in stark visual terms how fines are not being applied fairly across the community. I would use anonymized data to protect my neighbor's privacy, but the map would show a clear concentration of enforcement on a few select households. This would resonate with anyone else who had ever felt unfairly targeted by the board and would broaden the issue beyond just my personal grudge. Act 3, the Queen's Castle. The grand finale. I would present the irrefutable evidence of Brenda's own major violation. I wouldn't just show a photo. I would display the official county plat map, the aerial imagery, and my own GIS analysis, layering them one on top of the other to show, with millimeter precision, how her prize deck was illegally encroaching on the public utility easement. To make this work, I needed more than just my own data. I needed to understand the legal framework. I called the one person I knew would give me straight, no-nonsense advice, Uncle Frank. I met him for coffee, laying out my stack of violation notices and showing him the preliminary maps on my laptop. He listened intently, his expression growing more grim with each piece of evidence I presented. "She's on a power trip, Alex," he said after I finished. "I see it all the time with small-time officials. Give someone a little bit of authority and a fancy title, and they think they're Caesar. The selective enforcement is bad, but this," he said, pointing at the map of Brenda's deck, "this is a genuine problem. That's not just an HOA issue. That's a city code violation." He explained that if the city's code enforcement division were to be notified, they would be obligated to investigate. They would issue a notice of violation, and if she didn't remedy the situation, which would mean demolishing a significant portion of her expensive deck, she would face daily fines from the city, far more substantial than the petty ones she was handing out. "So, I should just call code enforcement?" I asked. "You could," he said, taking a sip of his coffee, "and they would handle it. But that's a single shot. It takes her down, but it doesn't fix the systemic problem. You said it yourself. She has friends on the board. They'll just appoint another crony, and the harassment might continue. If you want to fix the problem, you have to expose the entire system to the light. You have to show all the homeowners what's been going on. You need to win over the people." He was right. A quiet report to the city would give me personal satisfaction, but a public reveal at the annual meeting could lead to real change. It could get Brenda and her cronies voted off the board and replaced with reasonable people. Your plan for the meeting is sound, he continued, but you need to be prepared. She'll try to shut you down. You need to know the bylaws on homeowner presentations inside and out. Find the section that give you the right to speak and have it ready. And when you present, stick to the facts. No emotion, no accusations for being a Karen, just data. Maps, photographs, documents. Let the evidence speak for itself. People can argue with an opinion, but they can't argue with a certified plat map. He also gave me a crucial piece of advice. Get allies, he said. That heat map is powerful. Talk to the other people in those red zones. See if they've had similar experiences. If you're the only one speaking up, you're a lone crank. If you have 3 or 4 other homeowners standing with you, your movement. Over the next few weeks, I did just that. I discreetly approached the other homeowners who lived in the red zones on my map. There was the Rodriguez family, who had been fined for their son's portable basketball hoop, even though several other homes had identical ones. There was Mrs. Davison, an elderly widow who was being threatened with a lien on her house over the color of her geraniums. There was the Miller family, who were new to the country and were being buried in fines for things they didn't even understand. Their stories were all the same. They had tried to reason with Brenda, tried to comply, but the harassment was relentless. When I showed them my data, their eyes lit up with a mixture of anger and validation. They weren't crazy. They weren't bad neighbors. They were targets. They all eagerly agreed to attend the annual meeting and to stand with me. My solo project had become a small rebellion. While I was building my army, Brenda was growing more brazen. Oblivious to the storm gathering below, she was at the peak of her arrogance. The HOA newsletter that month featured a glowing profile of her, titled A Commitment to Excellence, complete with a professional photo of her smiling serenely on her beautiful, illegal deck. The irony was so thick, I could practically taste it. The stage was being set. I finalized my presentation, printing my maps on huge poster boards that would be impossible to ignore. I prepared a concise, fact-based script. I queued up the relevant sections of the bylaws on my tablet. I felt a nervous energy, the kind you get before a final exam or a big game. Brenda thought she was in control. She thought she was the one who knew and enforced the rules. But she was about to find out that the quiet cartographer next door had a much better map of the territory. The weeks leading up to the annual meeting were a blur of meticulous preparation. I felt like a lawyer preparing for a landmark case. Every evening was spent refining my presentation, triple-checking my data, and coordinating with my newfound allies. We had a few quiet meetings in my living room, sharing stories and solidifying our plan. The Rodriguez family would speak about the inconsistent enforcement of rules regarding children's play equipment. Mrs. Davison would share her heartbreaking story of feeling harassed and targeted in her own home of 30 years. The Millers, though nervous about speaking publicly, agreed to be present as a show of solidarity. My role was to be the architect of the takedown, presenting the cold, hard data that underpinned all of our experiences. The final piece of my puzzle was ensuring I would actually get the chance to speak. As Uncle Frank had advised, I scoured the HOA's governing documents. Tucked away in Article 3, Section 4, was the clause I needed. Any member in good standing shall be granted no less than 10 minutes to address the board and assemble members on matters of community concern during the new business portion of the annual meeting. The key phrase was, in good standing. Brenda's campaign of fines was designed not just to punish me, but to strip me of that status. If I had outstanding, unpaid fines, she could legally deny me the right to speak. So, the day before the meeting, I did something that felt like swallowing poison. I wrote a check to the Willow Creek Estates HOA for the full amount of every single fine she had levied against me, totaling over $900. I included a letter with the payment, stating, "This payment is made under protest to retain my status as a member in good standing and is not an admission of guilt for the alleged violations." I hand-delivered it to the HOA's management company, got a stamped receipt, and made a dozen copies. It was a calculated risk, a painful investment, but it was the price of admission to the arena. She could no longer silence me on a technicality. The day of the meeting, the atmosphere in the community clubhouse was thick with a kind of stale tension. About 50 homeowners were present, more than the usual dozen, a testament to the simmering discontent Brenda had fostered. Most were there out of a sense of civic duty, ready to be bored by budget reports and landscaping contracts. They had no idea they were about to witness a coup. Brenda and her two bored cronies, a sour-faced man named Gary and a woman who nodded at everything Brenda said, sat at a long table at the front of the room. Brenda, dressed in a power-red blazer, beamed at the crowd, the benevolent dictator surveying her subjects. The meeting droned on through the usual agenda items. The treasurer's report, the landscaping committee's update on mulch, a lengthy and pointless debate about the color of the new pool umbrellas. I sat patiently, my heart thrumming a steady, nervous rhythm against my ribs. My poster-sized maps were rolled up in a cardboard tube at my feet. My tablet, with all my files ready to go, sat on my lap. Finally, Brenda announced, "That concludes the old business. We will now move on to new business." This was my moment. I stood up. "Brenda, according to Article 3, Section 4 of the bylaws, I'd like to use my 10 minutes to address the members on a matter of community concern." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Public comments were rare and usually limited to complaints about dog poop. Brenda's smile froze on her face. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits. "Alex," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "as I've told you before, this is not the venue for personal disputes about fines. And besides, to address the board, you must be a member in good standing." She looked at her crony, Gary, who was already shuffling through a folder. "Gary, could you confirm Mr. Thompson's status?" Gary pulled out a sheet of paper. "According to our records, Mr. Thompson has $927 in outstanding fines. He is not in good standing. The trap had been sprung." Brenda smirked, ready to gavel me into silence. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said, the insincerity practically oozing from her pores. "You are not permitted to speak. Please sit down." I didn't move. I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the stamped receipt from the management company. "Actually, Brenda, I am in good standing," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I paid the full amount yesterday under protest. Here is the receipt from our own management company, dated and time-stamped. I believe you'll find everything is in order." I walked to the front and placed the receipt on the table in front of her. The room was silent. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Brenda stared at the piece of paper as if it were a snake. Her face, which had been a mask of smug authority, was now a canvas of pure fury. She was outmaneuvered. She had no choice. To deny me the floor now would be such a blatant violation of the bylaws that even her most ardent supporters would have to object. She looked at Gary, who just shrugged helplessly. "Very well," she hissed through gritted teeth. "The bylaws say you have 10 minutes. The clock is ticking." She made a great show of tapping her watch. She thought she could wait me out. That 10 minutes wasn't enough time to do any real damage. She was wrong again. I turned to face the assembled homeowners, took a deep breath, and began. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Alex Thompson, and I live at 124 Oak Street. For the past 2 months, I've been engaged in a rather one-sided correspondence with our HOA board. It began when I was fined for things like the color of my mailbox and the placement of a garden gnome. I paused as a few titters went through the crowd. "I'm not here tonight to complain about my fines. I am here to talk about data, about fairness, and about the integrity of our community leadership. I am here to present evidence." With that, I walked over to an empty wall and, with a dramatic flourish, unrolled my first map. It was a large, clean map of the entire subdivision, with my house highlighted in red. This was Act 1. The first map I unrolled was a detailed plot of my own property. On it, I had superimposed labels and call-out boxes corresponding to every single violation I had been accused of. I used a pointer to walk the audience through each one. This first fine, I began, my voice calm and measured, was for unapproved lawn ornamentation. As you can see from this attached time-stamped photograph, my garden gnome was, for a period of 12 hours, 2 inches outside the designated flower bed. a flower bed which I subsequently rebuilt to be in perfect compliance with Section 74A of the Architectural Guidelines. I moved the pointer. This second fine was for improper mailbox maintenance. The accusation was that the color was not midnight black. Here are 3 photos. One of the mailbox belonging to board member Gary, and one of the midnight black paint swatch from the approved hardware store. I'll let you judge for yourselves if there's a discernible difference. Nevertheless, I repainted it. I continued this for every single fine, presenting my case with the dispassionate air of a scientist presenting a research paper. For the grass height violation, I showed a photo with a ruler stuck in the lawn. For the charge of having a dirty recycling bin, I presented the weekly municipal pickup schedule to show it had been photographed on the morning of trash day, just hours before it was due to be emptied. With each point, I could feel the mood in the room shifting. It started with mild amusement at the absurdity of the charges, but it slowly morphed into a quiet, simmering anger. People were starting to recognize the tactics. They were seeing not just a dispute between a homeowner and the board, but a clear case of targeted harassment. Brenda tried to interrupt. "This is a waste of our time. He's just complaining." But a few homeowners shushed her. They were hooked. They wanted to see where this was going. As I said, I continued, "I'm not here to complain. I am here to show a pattern." After meticulously bringing my property into what I can only describe as a state of hypercompliance, I wanted to understand how the rules were being applied to the rest of our community. I then unrolled my second and much larger map. It was the heat map. A collective gasp went through the room. The visual was stark and immediate. The map showed all 250 homes in the subdivision. Most of the properties were a cool green, indicating 0 violations or fines over the past 2 years. A handful were yellow, with 1 or 2 minor fines. But then there were 5 properties, including my own, that glowed in angry, pulsating red. This map represents the distribution of fines levied by the board over the last 24 months, I explained. The data was compiled from the official records which I, as a homeowner, requested and received from our management company. As you can see, over 90% of all fine revenue has been generated from just 5 households. Are we to believe that these 5 families are the only ones with minor imperfections on their properties? Or is something else going on here? I gestured to the Rodriguez family. The Rodriguez family, in that red house there, were fined nearly $600 because their son's basketball hoop was left out overnight, a violation they corrected immediately. Yet, my own ground-level survey, conducted over the past 6 weeks, found 17 other homes with identical basketball hoops, none of which have ever received a warning, let alone a fine. Mr. Rodriguez stood up. "It's true. We felt like we were being targeted from the day we moved in." I then pointed to Mrs. Davison's property on the map. Mrs. Davison, a resident here for 30 years, is facing a lien on her home because her geraniums were deemed an inappropriate shade of red, yet the bylaws contain no language whatsoever regarding flower color. Mrs. Davison, a frail but dignified woman, stood up, her voice trembling slightly. She told me my flowers were garish and lowered property values. I've been planting those same flowers every year since my husband passed. The room was electric now. The residents were murmuring to each other, outrage growing on their faces. They weren't just listening to my story anymore. They were listening to the stories of their neighbors. My personal grievance had become a community-wide indictment of Brenda's regime. She was squirming in her seat, her face pale. Gary was staring at his notes, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Brenda banged her gavel. "This is completely out of order. You are making baseless accusations and turning this meeting into a circus. Your 10 minutes are up." "Actually," I said, glancing at the clock on the wall, "I still have 2 minutes and 40 seconds left, and I've saved the most important piece of information for last." I let the tension hang in the air for a moment. I slowly and deliberately rolled up the heat map and unrolled my third and final exhibit. It was the most complex map of all, a multi-layered GIS plot showing the back of a single property. "This final map," I said, my voice dropping to a serious tone, "is about accountability. It's about the principle that those who enforce the rules must, above all, follow the rules themselves." This is a map of our HOA president's property. All eyes swiveled from the map to Brenda. Her face had gone from pale to ashen. The map was devastatingly clear. I had the official county plat map as the base layer, showing the property lines in black. Overlaid in a transparent blue was the 10-foot public utility easement. And overlaid on top of that was a red outline derived from high-resolution aerial photography and my own laser measurements. The outline of her deck. A significant portion of the red outline, including the locations of 2 concrete footings I had marked with an X, sat squarely inside the blue PUE area. As you can see, I explained, pointing to the overlapping colors, a substantial portion of this large, permanent deck structure is built on the public utility easement. This is not just a violation of HOA bylaws, which expressly forbid any construction on easements. It is a direct violation of City Code 1452. It is a safety hazard that could impede emergency access to our shared utilities. And it is a legal liability for every single one of us as members of this association. I let that sink in. The silence was absolute. I had done exactly what Uncle Frank advised. I presented cold, hard, verifiable facts. I had used certified documents, photographs, and data. There was no room for interpretation. There was no way for her to deny it. So while some of us are being fined hundreds of dollars for the color of our flowers or for a garden gnome being 2 inches out of place, I concluded, my voice ringing with clarity, our president has, for years, maintained a significant, illegal, and potentially dangerous structure on her property with zero consequences. My 10 minutes are now up. I have no further comments. I rolled up my final map and walked back to my seat. The room remained silent for a few seconds, and then it erupted. The explosion of noise was immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't just murmuring, it was a cacophony of angry, indignant voices all speaking at once. People who had sat silently through HOA meetings for years were suddenly on their feet, shouting questions and accusations at the front table. "Is this true, Brenda?" Someone yelled from the back. "Have you really been finding an old woman over her flowers while you have an illegal deck?" Mr. Rodriguez's voice cut through the din. "I want an answer. Why was my family targeted while you ignored this? We want a refund for every fine we've paid." Brenda, who had built her entire identity around being the infallible enforcer of rules, completely fell apart. Her composure shattered, replaced by a frantic, cornered desperation. She banged her gavel repeatedly, but the sound was lost in the uproar. "Order! Order! This is a malicious and personal attack," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "He's doctored those maps. They're fake." But her denial was weak and unconvincing. I had been too thorough. "They're not fake," I called out calmly from my seat. "The plat maps are certified copies from the county recorder's office. Case number 48B21. The aerial imagery is from the state's public GIS portal. The measurements were taken with a calibrated laser measurer. The evidence is verifiable by anyone who wishes to check. My statement acted like fuel on the fire. The fact that the data was public and verifiable meant her lie was transparent. It was over, and she knew it, but she couldn't accept it. Gary, her loyal crony, tried to defend her. "This is a private matter concerning one homeowner's property. It has no bearing on this meeting." Mrs. Davison, who had been quiet until now, found her voice. "It has every bearing," she declared, standing tall. "It shows hypocrisy. It shows that the rules are just a weapon for her to bully people she doesn't like. We trusted you, Brenda. You've been a tyrant." The word tyrant hung in the air, and it seemed to break the last dam of civility. A motion was shouted from the floor. "A move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the president," another homeowner yelled. "Seconded," came a chorus of voices. Brenda was frantic. "You can't do that. It's not on the agenda. It's against procedure." But she had lost control. The room was no longer hers to command. The members were taking their community back. A man I recognized as a retired lawyer stood up. "Actually, Brenda, according to Article 5, Section 2 of the bylaws, a vote of no confidence in any board member can be called at the annual meeting with a simple majority vote from the members present. We have a quorum. and the motion has been seconded. We must vote. Her face crumpled. Trapped by the very bylaw she had used to terrorize others, she had no escape. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Peterson, took charge of the room, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Brenda's hysteria. He proposed a simple show of hands. All those in favor of the motion of no confidence in Brenda as HOA president, please raise your hands. Nearly every hand in the room went up. I looked around and saw a sea of determined faces. The Millers, the Rodriguezes, Mrs. Davison, and dozens of others I had never even spoken to. It was a landslide. All opposed. Mr. Peterson asked. Only 2 hands went up, Gary's and the other board members. Brenda herself just sat there, stunned into silence, staring at the forest of hands raised against her. The motion carries, Mr. Peterson announced with finality. Brenda is hereby removed from her position as president of the board, effective immediately. A wave of applause and cheers swept through the room. It was a sound of liberation. Brenda just sat there, motionless, as her entire world crumbled around her. But the downfall was not yet complete. Mr. Peterson wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, his voice firm, I move that the board immediately rescind every fine issued in the past 12 months to the households identified as being part of a pattern of targeted enforcement. Seconded, came the immediate reply. Another show of hands, another overwhelming majority. My $900 and thousands more from the other targeted families would be refunded. And finally, Mr. Peterson said, looking directly at Brenda, I move that the board issue an official notice of violation to the homeowner at this property. He tapped my map of her deck, which was still on display, for the unapproved and illegal structure encroaching on the public utility easement, and that the homeowner be required to bring the property into full compliance with both HOA and city codes within 90 days. The vote on this final motion was unanimous, save for Brenda's 2 former cronies, who now looked terrified that they would be next. The meeting concluded with the election of a new interim board president, the calm and respected Mr. Peterson. Brenda didn't say another word. She sat through her own political execution in stunned silence. When the meeting was finally adjourned, she gathered her papers with trembling hands and practically fled the room, not making eye contact with anyone. She was no longer a queen. She was just a disgraced homeowner with a very expensive demolition project in her future. As people were leaving, many came up to shake my hand or clap me on the shoulder. Mr. Rodriguez gave me a heartfelt hug. Thank you, he said. You gave us our voice back. Mrs. Davison held my hand. You're a good boy, Alex. You stood up to a bully. I just nodded, feeling a profound sense of relief and satisfaction. I hadn't just won a personal victory. We had reclaimed our community from the clutches of a petty tyrant. My quiet life had been disrupted, but in the end, the result was a neighborhood that was more fair, and finally, more peaceful. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and decisive. Brenda's reign of terror ended not with a whimper, but with the resounding crash of her own illegally built deck. The newly constituted HOA board, led by the sensible Mr. Peterson, formally issued the violation notice as their first order of business. True to form, Brenda initially tried to fight it. She hired a lawyer and claimed the easement maps were outdated and that she had received a verbal approval from a long-dead developer 20 years ago. But her blustering was useless against the mountain of certified documents. The city's Code Enforcement Division, tipped off by an anonymous but very well-documented complaint that I may or may not have submitted online, conducted their own survey and issued their own, much more menacing, notice of violation. They gave her 30 days to submit a demolition plan. Faced with daily fines from the city that would have dwarfed anything she had ever levied, she finally capitulated. Watching the demolition crew dismantle her prized deck piece by piece was a deeply satisfying, almost poetic conclusion to the whole affair. The symbol of her hypocrisy, the stage for her smug newsletter photos, was reduced to a pile of lumber in a dumpster. Her beautiful, award-winning landscaping was torn up to allow access for the equipment needed to remove the concrete footings from the easement. Her backyard, once a manicured paradise, was now a muddy scar. But her punishment didn't end there. The public humiliation was absolute. Neighbors who had once feared her now openly ignored her. Her two cronies on the board, Gary and the other woman, resigned in disgrace a week after the meeting, wanting to distance themselves from the sinking ship. Brenda was a pariah in the community she had once ruled with an iron fist. She put her house on the market less than 6 months later and moved away. I heard from a neighbor that she moved to a condo complex with no yard and a very, very strict set of rules, which I found to be a fittingly ironic fate. With Brenda gone and a new, reasonable board in place, a wave of positive change swept through Willow Creek Estates. The board held a bylaw review meeting, and with input from the community, they voted to eliminate many of the most ambiguous and petty rules. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. The newsletter, once a platform for Brenda's self-aggrandizement, now featured profiles of different families, announcements for block parties, and helpful gardening tips. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by one of friendliness and cooperation. The fines that had been rescinded were promptly refunded. When I received the check for $927 from the HOA, it felt like the most satisfying money I had ever held. I immediately donated it to the community fund to help pay for the new playground equipment at the neighborhood park. My life returned to the peaceful state I had craved when I first moved in. I could enjoy my backyard without fear of a white envelope appearing on my door. My garden gnome stood proudly on his patch of lawn, no longer a symbol of defiance, but just a cheerful piece of kitsch. The neighbors I had united in our little rebellion became genuine friends. The Rodriguez family often came over for barbecues, our kids playing together in the yard. I helped Mrs. Davison set up a new sprinkler system for her garish but beautiful geraniums. We had created a real community, forged in the fire of Brenda's petty tyranny. One cool autumn evening, about a year after that fateful HOA meeting, I was out in my backyard. I had a small, crackling fire going in my pit. The logs smelled of hickory, and the stars were bright overhead. I had a beer in my hand and a book in my lap. It was the same scene as the night this whole ordeal began, but everything felt different. It was a deeper, more earned peace. My Uncle Frank, who was over for dinner, came out and sat in the chair next to me. We watched the flames in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "You know," he said finally, "when you called me for advice, I knew you had the skills to figure it out. But I honestly didn't know if you had the guts to see it through." I smiled. "I didn't either, to be honest. I just wanted to be left alone. Sometimes you can't be," he said. "Sometimes a bully picks your door to knock on, and you either let them knock it down or you build a better door. You did good, Alex. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone. Looking back on it all, I learned a valuable lesson. Power, especially small, unchecked power, can be a corrupting poison." Brenda believed she was untouchable because for years, no one had ever called her out. People are often too busy, too intimidated, or too tired to fight back against petty injustice. They just pay the fine or pull the weed or repaint the mailbox, hoping to be left alone. But what I discovered is that bullies and tyrants, big and small, often build their empires on foundations of lies and hypocrisy. Their greatest fear is the truth. My superpower wasn't GIS software or an understanding of bylaws. It was simply the willingness to do the work, to gather the facts, and to hold them up to the light. The moral of this story isn't to go looking for fights. It's that when a fight finds you, knowledge is your best weapon, preparation is your best armor, and the truth is your sharpest sword. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small or powerless in your own home, on your own property. The rules should serve the community, not the ego of the person enforcing them. So, let me ask you this. Have you ever had to stand up to a bully who thought they had all the power? How did you find the strength and the strategy to fight back? Because sometimes the most satisfying victories come from simply and methodically proving them wrong.